Welcome to our Chicago Parent Podcast, Masters in Parenting. I'm your host, Hillary Burr. Joining us today to talk about food and feeding kids is Dr. Rebecca Unger. Dr. Unger has been in private practice as a general pediatrician with Northwestern Children's Practice for almost 3 decades. She also works on nutrition education projects with the local Illinois chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and she had spent 2 decades at Lurie Children's Hospital as an attending pediatrician in the Lurie Wellness and Weight Management Clinic. Welcome, Dr. Unger, and thank you so much for joining our podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Is there one thing that you think that parents can do today to set their kids on a path toward good eating habits?
Fortunately, I think there is something that could be very helpful. I think it's important for parents to understand that being a good role model as far as making healthy choices for lots of things, in particular for healthy nutrition and healthy physical activity, and that can really benefit your family. And truthfully, these role model patterning practices can start almost prenatally. So how you make your choices to improve your own health, really from even before you have your baby, is really important. And then once you have your baby, even if you have a young infant, all the way through as they grow up, they are observing how you make choices and how you keep yourself healthy. So first, it becomes even more important when they're older and you're engaging in family meals, which, by the way, happens pretty quickly. But it's very important to be a good role model as far as how you choose healthy foods, how you choose to be active yourself, and how you choose for your family patterning to improve everyone's health.
What are some of the best practices that you found to start kids eating healthy and eating nutritiously? I think that's a really cool concept that, as you decided to start your family, that's sort of the way that's when you decide, okay, if I'm going to eat healthy, I know my kids will start eating healthy. So once you have kids and you've started, introducing food to them, what are some of the best practices to start kids eating really healthy and eating nutritious foods?
Our parent organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics. So the very first thing to think about is how you'll feed your infant. We do recommend breastfeeding basically up through 1 year of life, which is hard to do. But when possible, we do strongly recommend that breastfeeding is the healthiest choice. And in particular, we recommend exclusive breastfeeding up through 6 months of age. In the past, we used to introduce solid foods to babies between the age of 4 to 6 months, and a lot of times we were really starting more towards the 4-month time. But recently, related to that recommendation about exclusive breastfeeding and some other things we know about development, we are really more focusing on starting solid foods towards that 5 to 6 month time. And that's a time when developmentally babies are able to accept a spoon to their mouth and chew the food potentially and are able to carry on from pureed foods as they get introduced to more foods and more textures, then go on to more textured foods. So 5 to 6 months is when the baby who has had a very strong reflex to suckle then has some changes in their mouth, and they're able to accept a spoon to their mouth and better able to handle the texture of the solid food.
I remember I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And I remember when we started our 3-year-old, our pediatrician told us, start with green beans and peas first. Don't start with bananas because if you start with bananas, your kid will never get to green beans because it's so sweet that you need to start with something a little bit bitter. Is that still recommended, or was that just to make sure that she was getting green beans first?
Well, it kind of logically makes sense, but there's no scientific basis for that. So if we start with a vegetable rather than a fruit, I don't think that means your baby is going to enjoy the healthier foods more than sweeter foods. So really the recommendation at this point is that you can start with anything. By that we mean fruit or vegetable or protein or grains, really anything. We used to start with 1 grain cereal and see how that goes for a while. And we definitely do not have that recommendation anymore. The recommendation really is that you can start with anything of those food groups.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. We had
It's
boxes
different
of,
than before, right? It's
yeah.
different than before. It's a little bit easier, and we still recommend that you should stick with one food at a time to see if there's a reaction. For example, a rash or a blood or significant vomiting or something like that. So you want to start with one food at a time, and then after several days of that, you can go on to another food. And once you have your repertoire increased of several different foods, then I think it's also nice for a baby to get several foods at each meal. And by that, I mean not necessarily mushed up together, but sort of like how we eat our meals. You would give several different foods, side by side, and let your baby enjoy a variety of tastes and eventually a variety of textures.
That's
Fun.
That is really cool. That I think that's something that in our home we didn't start to do until each girl sort of hit one. We were like, okay, now that you have a whole palette of things that we know that you like, you're not just going to get this one until you finish it. And the idea of starting that a lot earlier probably makes dinner for your babies a lot more fun to eat, because they can see and try a bunch of different textures and tastes all at once.
Right. I think oftentimes parents are hesitant to move forward with different textures. So certainly you start with pureed foods, and whether you make them yourselves or you buy them at the grocery store, either way is fine. It is kind of handy to make them yourself, and you can freeze them in an ice cube tray and then take out little bits at a time and give your child portions of that. But also, once you have increased the repertoire a bit, then I think it's nice to go on to chunkier and lumpier foods so your child gets used to a variety of tastes and textures. And the other thing that I strongly recommend, and this is not always intuitive for some families, I think, is to think about a family meal, or maybe this could be thought of as a precursor to a family meal, where you really bring your child up to the table. You might have a high chair, you might have a high chair tray, but I kind of like the idea of losing the high chair tray and really bringing your child up to the table to eat with other people. And even as early as 6 months or so, even though you're going to gradually increase this experience over the, 6 to 9 months, 6 to 12 months, that second half of the first year, I think it's really important to start eating together as a family, even as early as 6 months. So your baby is observing what's happening at your meal, and you might have other children as role models and you guys as role models, and pulling your child up to the table, giving a variety of foods, advancing textures. I think it can happen pretty quickly once your child is 6 months old. It sort of also depends on the child. Some children might be a little more sensitive and you might take it a little bit slower. But you can definitely work your way towards different foods, different tastes, different textures once your baby is 6 months and on up from there. Another thing that I like to recommend for a 6-month-old baby is to introduce your baby to a sippy cup. And by that I mean any kind of sippy cup. I don't have a specific recommendation, but I think it's helpful to put your child's favorite beverage in a sippy cup. So that might be breast milk. It might be some formula, maybe a little bit of water. And that way your baby will learn to drink from a cup just like the rest of the family. And then when your baby is towards 1 year of age, and I do like getting out of the bottle somewhere around 1 year of age, a little bit later maybe, and then they won't say, why is there white stuff in my cup? So if you start putting breast milk or formula, if they're drinking that, in a sippy cup, then even though they won't be very good at it at 6 months, it's at least the beginning of that. And then whatever they don't drink, we certainly don't like to waste breast milk, then you could toss it in a bottle and then they could have that maybe on their way to a nap or something like that. But introducing the sippy cup around 6 months also I think is helpful, and it's important to have the role modeling during your family meal time with other people drinking from their beverage in a cup.
I really like that idea of bringing kids straight to the table, and take away the tray that early so that they can see, how a family sits down to a meal, and that they can, I wonder too if that sort of would help some. I remember when my girls started, eating the same thing that we ate. It was all they get to the end and immediately throw it on the floor. I
Right.
wonder.
And there's a lot of interesting behaviors that can happen at a table, and we've got lots of tricks up our sleeves to work with that. But I also think that parents might not recognize that the children are the babies are bored of their, plain pureed foods, and they really do want to eat what the family eats. And truthfully, there's only two foods that babies should not eat, other than being aware of textures. Of course, we don't want babies to choke on things that are going to be a hazard for the airway and things like that. But the two foods that they can't eat are milk, because the milk function in milk is you want to wait until the child is 1 year old for milk, but they can have milk products like cottage cheese and yogurt and cheese, things like that, and honey. We don't want honey until a child is a 1 year old. But besides that, you can give your baby all those other foods that you eat that are a texture that the baby can handle. You would do that once you've introduced a variety of the, pureed foods or more chunkier foods. And then what I like to do is ask the family, what do you as a family eat for dinner? And then they might say, like chicken and green beans or beans and rice or something like that. And all those things, if you chop them up small enough and sometimes mix them with the pureed foods so the baby has a little old and a little new texture, that can be very helpful. But it is great for a family to share the same foods when possible.
I remember when I was a kid, my personal pediatrician had told my parents no nuts, not peanut butter was fine, but no actual peanuts until I was 5 because of the choking hazard. I don't know if that's still a recommendation. We've sort of avoided it in our house, and we were at a recent party, and our 3-year-old reached for the nuts, and my husband grabbed him back and said, "No, not till you're 5." So I don't know. I don't know if that's still a recommendation.
Well, we always worry about choking hazards. The perfectly wrong shape might be, like a peanut or like a carrot cut this short way or something like that, like a round thing, something that could get caught in the airway or they could breathe in the airway. So shape-wise, you still want to be careful about choking hazards until your child is, I would say, between 3 and 5 sort of thing. The question about waiting for exposure to peanuts in particular is a very interesting question and changing rapidly. So we used to delay the introduction of peanuts and nuts and things like that because we were worried about the development of food allergies. And recently, and this has been in the news a bunch, there's a study that was done in England in 2015, which was in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at the difference of babies who were exposed to peanuts early on compared to later on, and what was the development of peanut allergy. And what we're finding more and more, and the recommendation is changing, is that we should introduce our children to peanuts in particular earlier. So what the recommendation is to first introduce some of those solid foods that we talked about, and then once you see that they're developmentally able to handle that, then for children who do not have severe eczema or maybe history of egg allergy, which is a little hard to tell as an infant, but let's just say who do not have moderate to severe eczema even, it is a good idea to early on to introduce them to the peanuts. And one way you could certainly do that with peanut butter. There are peanut butter powders, things like that. And that actually may help prevent or reduce a peanut allergy. Now, we could use the same concept, sort of extrapolate, as my allergist friends have explained to me. We could extrapolate to say that for other kinds of nuts and other kind of foods that are more allergic or more kids tend to have more allergies, like shellfish. But so we don't know specifically the science behind that, but the concept is, instead of waiting to introduce these foods that may have a higher incidence of allergies, it could be helpful to introduce them early. Now, on the other hand, if you have and very importantly, if you have a baby who has moderate to severe eczema, it's even more important to determine if they should be introduced to these peanuts and maybe other foods earlier. But those children should be referred to an allergist. and they would do some testing to look for a peanut allergy, maybe the other foods. And if they are allergic, it doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't be fed these foods earlier, but it should be done in a setting where we could handle an allergic reaction. So it's very different than what we used to do. We used to definitely wait until at least 3 years or so to introduce peanuts or nuts, and then it got a little earlier and earlier. And now it's really still in that, or newly in this earlier age when you're introducing solid foods in general to purposefully introduce peanuts and maybe other foods early on to prevent food allergies. It's very exciting.
That's really cool. That was something I remembered. We started introducing peanut butter early, but I think it was just the actual peanuts. That's actually good to know that we can let her try the peanut itself, as long as we're watching and paying attention, that they can eat peanuts. You brought up bringing up the allergies. Is sort of a perfect segue into kids who have allergies and those kind of intolerances. What do parents of kids with allergies need to be aware of, and what do the parents of kids who have friends with allergies really need to pay attention to and be aware of as they're as they're teaching their children proper nutrition as they get older and can start making their own decisions?
Well, I think it's important for parents of young children to make sure they communicate very carefully with an allergist, because these allergies will be defined by a specialist. This is not something that would happen in your general pediatric office, but you will be allied with a pediatric allergist who will help the family define what the child is allergic to. And that might be something simple like one food like peanuts, or it might be something that can show up in foods when you don't know that they're there. So it's important to learn from your allergist what your child is allergic to and how to read food labels. That's very important that you make sure that you learn to do that. As your child gets older, then you want to make sure that your child knows what he or she is allergic to and how to ask for help to make sure a specific food doesn't have that food that they're allergic to. And always, depending on the type of allergy, you want to have your EpiPen with you. I usually recommend that you should have two together, because if one doesn't work, you need a second one. And oftentimes in my office, I say, show me the EpiPen. And a lot of times they say it's in the car or it's at home or whatever. Now, obviously, you have time to get to an emergency room if you're near one, but I think ideally when you travel around, or your child should always have an EpiPen with them or near them or at school or something like that. As far as friends go, I think it makes sense for parents who have children with food allergies help the parent to help you when you have a friend over or something like that. You cannot know the medical problem of your child's friend unless you're told. So I think it's really just like a lot of things, communication between parents and the school and things like that. It's just important to understand what the food allergy is and what symptoms to look for and when to call for help, when you need to use EpiPen, things like that. And it's really all about communication and also your child as they get older to be able to know themselves what they're allergic to and how to avoid that food.
I appreciate too that, in the last 20 years, you see a lot more awareness at restaurants and a lot more awareness at schools of allergies and intolerances and what those can do. That it doesn't just mean, that a kid is going to, break out or get an upset stomach. In some cases, like you said, with an EpiPen, you're really talking a life and death situation. And, I think in the last 20 years, you've really seen that adjustment at restaurants and, preschools and even schools. And have you found too in your practice that even parents of kids without allergies tend to be a little bit more aware of that allergies can happen early?
I think so. I think it's more and more discussed at schools and, helping families know what you can pack in your lunch and what you can't pack in your lunch and things like that. And that should be helpful in terms of educating families in general.
I wondered too, and this is going off and just making sure that kids have good nutrition. Have you found, does hiding good food and good food purees and that kind of thing in baked goods like muffins and cookies, does that really work? Or is that just sort of hiding food in something that kids think are bad for them?
I think that every little bit helps. So it depends on the child. So if you have a child who's a very adventurous eater and you can give them Brussels sprouts and they love them, then you certainly don't have to hide beet juice in your brownies. But some kids aren't like that. So I think in general, our recommendation is that kids should have 3 meals a day and they should have 2 or 3 healthy snacks a day. And I always like to help families understand that my least favorite snacks are like those crackery kind of snacks. So in order to help understand that, I think it's always a good idea to include a fruit or vegetable or several food groups in a snack. And there's a great website, choosemyplate.gov, that has a lot of recommendations for feeding families based on age and gender and things like that. It's a great website. But and I'm getting back to your question, but the thing is, we do want 3 meals a day, several healthy snacks. Each of the meals and snacks should include fruits and vegetables. We recommend for children that they have like 5 fruits and vegetables a day. So almost every meal and or snack should include a fruit or vegetable. So if your child eats that readily, then you don't need to hide the food. But if your child doesn't, then that is one way to do it. And even if your child does eat fruits and vegetables, it can't hurt. Like if you put some greens in a smoothie or you hide some mushrooms or greens or something in spaghetti sauce and you blend it up really well, then they're just getting more fruits and vegetables. So I never think that that's a bad idea. I think it's a very good idea if you have a child who's sort of a picky eater, who's on what I call the beige diet, where they don't like anything with color and they like pasta and bread and pizza and things like that. And those children, you do want to sneak it in whenever you can. So I think it's a fine method, and I think it's good for children and for adults, really.
Are there ways of getting picky eaters to become a little bit more adventurous?
Well, I think the recommendations for picky eaters is actually similar to non-picky eaters. My favorite quote is something I learned from a nutritionist whose name is Ellen Satter. And she says that parents provide, children decide. So unless you have someone who has a worrisome trend in the growth chart, and that would be something that you would determine at your pediatric visit, if there's something wrong with the weight-height relationship, then this might be a different story, or maybe not. But in general, I think that parents should provide healthy choices and children should decide what to eat, even if they're picky.
Uh-huh. And now to sort of wrap us up here, what do you think is the biggest shift you've seen over the last 3 decades, good or bad, in how and what kids are eating?
I think one shift that's not so good is it's easy to eat unhealthy food and it's cheap to eat unhealthy food. So a lot of children are choosing really making unhealthy choices as far as what they grab when they're with their friends and fast food eating out and things like that. The good news is we know that with focus on family meals that the foods are more nutritious, and the role modeling at the table can actually prevent adolescent risk-taking behaviors, and there's just so much to learn around a meal table. So the bad news is it's easy to make unhealthy choices. The good news is we really can make a difference with our children by encouraging eating together, planning meals together, maybe cooking together, setting a nice table, light a candle during your dinner time maybe, and enjoy that time together.
These are some incredibly helpful tips from Dr. Rebecca Unger, who joined us today on our Chicago Parent Podcast, Masters in Parenting. Thank you so much for your time, Rebecca Unger.
Thank you very much for having me.